Gut. Ich glaube, wir warten. Wie viel Uhr ist es? 5 nach? Ne? Okay. Yes. Good morning, everybody. I welcome you all to this Friday early morning session on evaluation. That's what development specialists always dream about at the end of the day. At the end of the week, early in the morning on Friday, to talk about and discuss evaluation issues. So, welcome to you all, to those who made it here. And this session, this panel, is going to prove that an evaluation panel is something really exciting. It's something really exciting, full of knowledge, full of controversy, and full of insights for our discussions about how to move the sustainability agenda forward and how to more effectively and more efficiently bridge the link between research and policy. My name is Jörg Faust. I am a director of a relatively young, new institution born in 2012, namely the German Institute for Development Evaluation, and we have the task, we are mandated by the German government to evaluate strategically German development cooperation. And I'm really honored to be one of the co-organizers of this conference and to have those distinguished specialists here at the panel, which will enlighten us with their knowledge about how to bridge research and policy, how to bridge evaluation and policy making in a world where the increasingly complex setting of the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 makes it challenging to really provide policymakers with crisp and practical information from evaluation. And for this purpose, we will have a first round, and where each of the panelists will provide some insights from his special background to the evaluation agenda, and then we move forward and have in a second round insights and experiences about how to best bridge evaluation and policy making, and then we will ask you as the audience to help us to challenge us with our contributions, and we'll open up. So let me start with Susanne Früh. Susanne Früh is the chair of the United Nations Evaluation Group, UNEC, and she is the head of the evaluation and internal oversight of UNESCO. Susanne, you have ample experience with multilateral organizations. You have been working for many years in this field, and I would like to ask you, where does the UN system stand currently in its endeavors to evaluate and to monitor progress regarding the SDG agenda. And I would also like to ask you in how far this multilateral setting fits well with national endeavors to build up evaluation capacities at the national level in developing countries, which are necessary in order to monitor and to evaluate SDG progress.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for inviting me here. When I arrived and I realized I almost didn't know anyone in this group, I was actually very happy, because we end up talking to each other only, and we need to really talk to others. So bringing everyone together, this nexus between policy, research, and also evaluation for me is really critical. So I'm very happy to be here. Now, the Agenda 2030 is a challenge to everyone. It's the biggest agenda ever. It's challenging all of us, the countries, the UN, to do better, to achieve very, very ambitious goals. And that has, I think, for the UN, created a very serious discussion inside, asking ourselves, are we still relevant, and can we help countries achieve these goals, and how do we do this? So it's really pushed us to do better, so it has led to a lot of internal reform, and some of that internal reform, of course, is also relating to evaluation. Now, when the SDGs were being discussed, I recall early on, we tried to get in through the door and be at the table. We said evaluation is important. You need to know where you're going. You need to have the evidence to inform progress and policy making. We were basically kept outside. It was a discussion that did not take place with evaluation at the table. And that was a pity for us. And we've ever since then tried to carve out a role for evaluation as part of the Agenda 2030. Now, I do believe the tide is starting to turn, in part because the data that is being collected is showing that progress is not being achieved, that we're not doing as well as we thought we should be by 2019, and 2030 being around the corner. So we see a lot of opportunities. Now, when at the time of the SDG discussions, there was talk about evaluations, mostly M&E, and it was monitoring evaluation at the country level done by national governments. And what happened then was the development of a voluntary national reporting system. So these reports are going to the UN once a year. They're being discussed in New York. More and more countries are coming with their reports. So we started looking at these reports, and that's where we opened, I believe, the door for evaluation, because the reports are not providing evaluation evidence. They're not very well written. They're very mixed. There's no common format to them, no common methodology. It's a missed opportunity. It's a real missed opportunity to discuss policy and to trigger change. So the voluntary national reporting is being reviewed, and we do see more and more countries, in particular countries from developing nations, speak about evaluation, using evaluative evidence to discuss progress or lack of progress. So I do believe from that point we're moving into the right direction. Now, where does UN evaluation comes in? The UN evaluation offices are organized in the UN evaluation group. I'm the chair of that group. We're about 50 evaluation offices, and we look at 3 key objectives. We're setting norms and standards for evaluation. We're professionalizing the function. And we're also trying to influence. We're trying to influence policymaking, so very much in line with what you are doing. Now, we realized that in order to be relevant to this whole debate on SDGs and Agenda 2030, we have to step up, because the SDGs are hugely complex, interlinkages, difficult to get data, a lot of performance indicators with a lot of lacking data. So it's a challenge to everyone to carve out a role for themselves. And we have started a discussion inside the UN evaluation group. And we realized that it cannot be just one organization, one office that can do this. It really has to be done in partnership with many others. So 3 of the strategies we're now looking at, I would like to speak about in more detail. The first one is we're talking about a global agenda, a common agenda. Now, a common agenda has to have common evaluation. You cannot just evaluate in isolation. You have to look at the whole picture. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to organize ourselves to evaluate more jointly, to evaluate at the system-wide level. And that's, of course, a huge challenge because of, still working more or less in silos at the agency level. So alongside the UN system that is trying to work more in coordination, working more together, we are trying to do the same on the evaluation side. And we do recognize that we don't have the tools to do that, so we're working on the tools for that. We're developing guidance, we're piloting different types of evaluations, and we're also testing. And one of the tests or pilots we've done recently is to look at SDG 4.5, equity and inclusive education for all. We've basically canvassed the horizon, looked at what is out there in terms of evaluative evidence since 2015, and we brought together some 800 evaluation reports, which is massive. But once we started looking at them, we started tossing out a lot of them because they were either not that well done, or they were really micro level and they didn't speak to a bigger picture. So we recognize from this experience that in order to speak about progress, in order to inform policymakers, we actually need to be more forward-looking. What we collected was backward-looking. It was not set up to ask the same question. So in the future, what we'd like to do is to develop an evaluation agenda by SDG and then create coalitions around these evaluation agendas. And these coalitions should really include researchers, civil society, influencers, decision makers. They need to be a coalitions of people that want to learn together and come out with the right kind of information, the right kind of evidence that will then eventually inform the way we can influence policy. We're also looking, in order to support that, at setting out a system-wide evaluation policy of the Secretary General, where the Secretary General, who's very supportive of evaluation, very clearly will say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and this is how we're going to use it in order to influence policymaking. So we will use that policy as a hook into policymaking, and I think we can also discuss that a bit later. The second strategy we're focusing on is, and I mentioned it already, is partnerships, working in partnerships with others. And again, here is where we need to find a common interest, and then we can do it, but we also need to plan for it. And one of the issues I've heard over the past few days is that research, for example, really takes much longer than what we do in the evaluation community. We have a much shorter time horizon, and somehow we need to make those two worlds connect. And that means, again, looking forward and planning forward and knowing that in 5 years' time, we have an opportunity to be somewhere at the right time. And then finally, coming to national capacity building for evaluation, it is a commitment of the UN. We have several UN resolutions on it. We're not there yet. I do believe that most of the evaluation offices don't have the capacity to build capacity. We are too small. We, as I was saying in the beginning, we only talk to each other in the end of the day, but we're missing really an opportunity to do something much more systematic. And I do believe we are finally starting to unpack national capacity building in a more rigorous way. This week was a big conference in Egypt, organized by UNDP. I was supposed to be there, but then I had my own boards to speak to back in Paris, so I didn't go. But I do believe this kind of conference shows there is a growing interest in evaluation. The conference focused on governments, on government institutions, but also brought academics, civil society, evaluators to that meeting to discuss no one left behind. So really looking at the SDGs and as a common thread, no one left behind, and what kind of methodologies are out there, what are the experience, and really countries speaking to each other and telling each other what they've been doing. And I do believe that is a step in the right direction, but much more needs to be done. The World Bank is currently looking at developing a platform for capacity building, linking it to World Bank programs. And I believe from the UN side, we are very interested in engaging on that, really seeing how at the country level we can support better evaluation architectures, working with national partners, building national capacities, and using national capacity much more than we have been. But I do admit we're nowhere near where we should be at this point in time, and we need to really roll up our sleeves and get on with it.
Thank you, Susanne. We might come back on this issue, on this challenge to create, to say so, a multi-level architecture which not only improves the connections among UN entities, but also links them up with the national and perhaps even further subnational evaluation challenges. I now welcome François Bourguignon. I think I do not have to introduce him anymore in length because he has been a GDN chair for many years, and you probably know him all. And what is, however, very worthwhile mentioning in this setting that François has been the chief economist of the World Bank during a time of another major development agenda, namely the MDGs. And even if the SDGs now are almost already 5 years old, we still remember the MDGs days, and perhaps some of us even remember that we already were discussing challenges of evaluation and monitoring during that time. And some of us thought, even in the times of the MDGs, that the MDGs were the rather complicated and complex agenda for evaluating. So I'm very happy to have François here to share perhaps some of his experiences and to compare from his experiences the challenges of evaluating the MDGs compared to the new challenges we face with regard to the evaluation of the SDGs and the sustainability agenda. François, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for allowing me to go back 15 years back. As a matter of fact, probably one of the first mission I had when joining the bank as a chief economist was to supervise the writing of the first so-called global monitoring report, which was an annual report on the advancement of the MDGs. And so very early, I got into this evaluation, monitoring and evaluation problem. Now, I would like to also congratulate the organizer of this conference for having this session on evaluation, and evaluation not being considered, as it is now the case today, as essentially experimenting and doing a randomized controlled trial. Evaluation is also something else. And this example of the MDGs and the SDGs, what Suzanne just said, shows that it is a completely different game, and it is an extremely difficult game. So let me get to what Jörg asked me to comment on, which is the experience of the MDGs. I would like to start with saying that there was something really good in the MDGs in terms of evaluation. It is the fact that we had an objective which was clearly stated. You have to remember that before the MDGs, development was many, many things. There was no agreement on what we should measure. You had a group of people saying we should stick to GDP. This is the only thing which matters. And other people saying, no, look, I mean, development is much more than that. You have to look at the societal change in the country. And so it is, and from that point of view, the MDGs was an interesting progress in the sense that suddenly we had much better, much more precise definition of what the goals were, and this was a multidimensional concept. In those days, in poverty analysis, we were starting to talk about multidimensional poverty measure. We were talking about multidimensional inequality measures, and from that point of view, this was, I believe, really a progress. So it is from the conceptual point of view. Now, when we look at the quote-unquote implementation, I think we have to say a lot about what we would call that implementation or not. I think that definitely there were incredible mistakes. And I think I will be repeating some of the points that Suzanne made. And unfortunately, I have the feeling that we didn't learn from our mistakes. And we are repeating exactly with the SDGs what the mistakes which were made with the MDGs, except for the fact that the context may not be as favorable as it was with the MDGs. I believe that the big mistake in the MDGs is that we had to make an ex-ante evaluation to try to see where we were going, whether it would be possible to reach the goals, and what was needed to reach the goals. And in what was needed, there are really two dimensions. One is, what is the strategy at the national level to be able to reduce poverty, to improve education, to improve health, and this is a very important part. Now, something was done. There was this institution called the Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers, which were something imposed by donors, in particular by the World Bank, asking countries to design the strategy that they would follow to reach the MDGs. The only thing is that countries were not prepared to do that. So remember that the first attempts at writing those poverty reduction strategy papers, the World Bank basically held the hand of all the countries. And the World Bank, I remember because I was a young consultant with them just before joining the bank, and I was asked to go to some countries and to tell the country, this is the way in which you have to write your PRSP. And as a matter of fact, the wording was already there. You only had to change the name of the country and the name of the capital city, and then it would be okay. So, of course, this is not a strategy. And really, we missed this aspect. Maybe we missed it because the knowledge, and this is related to this conference, was not there in the countries to do that. But the other aspect of the ex-ante evaluation was how much will it cost? Those countries will not be able to reach the MDGs by themselves. They need some help. How much will it cost? And somehow the whole debate on the MDGs became a debate on the costing. And Shanta Devarajan is in front of me. He was among the few people that whom the bank asked to do a costing exercise. And when I joined the bank, there was another costing exercise which was undertaken by Jeff Sachs with the United Nations. And for a while, I remember that there was a real fight between the UN, to some extent, and the World Bank on the other. The UN saying to the World Bank, look, you are underestimating what is needed, and the World Bank telling the UN, but you are overestimating what is needed. And when you look at the way in which this exercise was done, it was really not making sense. I mean, I'm not sure that it was of any use, in the sense that it was completely divorced from strategies. And instead of trying to see how we would be managing, we simply got into, I believe, was a sterile exercise. So I think that evaluation is much more than that, much more than putting numbers on those goals. And this was a very difficult exercise, because the goals are not independent. When you are doing something in one dimension, you're also achieving something in the other dimension. And knowledge is such that we are not able at this stage to look at the whole thing, at all the dimensions at the same time. We made progress, but we are not there yet. Now, last point on the MDGs, it is the ex post evaluation. So the results. And there, what we discovered when we tried to put together some monitoring strategy was really that the data were not there. In many countries, you had not even one household survey which would allow us to measure poverty, to measure education, enrollment, etc. And in many countries, we only had one of these surveys, and we needed to have at least two. In many other countries, we had two surveys, but they were absolutely not comparable. So we could not say anything about the progress which had been made. So from that point of view, the MDGs were important. Not sure that it was the only motivation, simply because it was an argument to push on the statistical agenda and to improve statistics. I think that we're in a much better position today. It is not perfect, but we certainly have more data. And from that point of view, the MDGs were quite, I think, important. Now, when we look at the final result of the MDGs, many people were satisfied with the fact that the main goal, which was to halve poverty, was reached. And certainly it was a motive for satisfaction. But when we get into the detail of that, and when we take out the role of China and to a lesser extent the role of India, we are left with results which are not really very satisfactory. And what is, I think, most important when we try to make the link with the SDGs is the fact that this was a very favorable period. The 2000s were very, very favorable to economic development in developing countries in particular, because this was a period of very high commodity prices. This was driven by the development of China, but we're certainly not these days in the same situation. So I will stop here. Maybe one word to really concur with what Suzanne has said about the SDGs. I mean, you can recognize that behind what I've just said about the MDGs, you had many problems that do appear with the SDGs. I mean, when we think about the costing, in the last meeting of the, what is it, the FFF? No, I mean, what are the funds, the funding, don't remember exactly the acronym. The Deputy Secretary General of the UN started his speech saying, okay, what we need is 2.5 trillion a year. And with Shanta in the bus, we were remembering that in those days, 15 years ago, when we were talking about the MDGs, there were barely 100 billion. Ridiculous. Okay, in comparison with 2.5 trillion. But can you realize that 2.5 trillion represent 3% of the world GDP? And when you look at the discussion and the decision taken in the Addis Ababa action agenda, etc., then you realize that the position of the international community is to say the funding has to come first of all from the countries. And so if the 3% of GDP, world GDP, you try to get it from developing countries only, and I'm not referring to low-income countries, then the share of GDP is absolutely enormous. So basically, this is simply impossible. And yet, the discussion as recently as a month ago is still with this kind of figure. So this shows that we definitely didn't learn from the MDG experience. Let's hope that we will be learning from the SDG experience, and that very shortly we will be able to change the course of things. I think I like very much the title of this session, which is Evaluating Sustainability. This is a long-run view, and this is something which is original in the evaluation business, if I can use that word. And I simply hope that we'll make progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francois. I think you made a crucial point on which I would like to come back later on with regard to your criticism on strategy and strategy implementation. Next is Emmanuel Jimenez, who is currently the Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, IIIE. And those of you who know IIIE and Manny Jimenez, they know that he leads an organization who has been very innovative, who has been crucial in pushing forward an evaluation agenda which is very strongly connected to rigorous experimental and quasi-experimental research and evaluation. And you probably all have witnessed a contested debate, but a very fruitful debate, I think, during the last decade around measuring impact with experimental and quasi-experimental methods. And but IIIE has not only promoted, fostered, and done individual impact evaluations, it has also contributed strongly to creating a global collective good by building up a repository and strengthening a repository where many of those impact evaluations are now brought together and serve or intend to serve as a global public knowledge good. So against this background, I would like to ask Manny Jimenez about his opinion. How do you think the work of IIIE and the rigorous impact evaluation agenda is connected with or connects with the agenda of evaluating sustainability, which is said to be very complex and comprehensive? And also in how far do you think, or do you think that IIIE's repository and other similar attempts can really serve and really provide a global knowledge good which is able to forward our sustainability agenda? Please.
Thanks, Jörg, and thanks again to you and the organizers for inviting me to this beautiful city and this wonderful site to speak to this. When you first asked me to do this, I think the way you phrased the question, which was a little different from how you did it now, and you said, to what extent are impact evaluations adequate to address the issue of the SDGs? And I felt a little bit like the ultimate straw man, that perhaps I was being set up. But I think it's actually a very good question. You're absolutely right that there are limitations, because Francois talked about the ex post, and if I were asked to evaluate the SDGs are a global agenda, and I start wondering about the counterfactual, and what is the control group? Mars? I don't think so. And so I think that there are limitations on this, and I think for that reason, I think the main job in terms of assessing progress towards the 200-something indicators in the SDGs, exactly what Susan and Francois talked about, is a really good monitoring system, a strategy for addressing them at the national level, and basically making sure that the data are there to do this right. Now that said, I think that the impact evaluation, as Jörg put it, which is this evaluation that really try to address causality, in which outcomes are related directly to interventions and are seen to be caused by them, is important in a couple of respects. One is, in order for the world to progress towards meeting those targets, the indicators have to move. And the question is, what works to make the needle move? And this is where, for example, target 1.1, which is proportion of population below the international poverty line, can actually be a very useful indicator on those individual evaluations of policies, programs, and projects that are the instruments for making that needle move. And to be able to know whether or not there is a causal effect is certainly got to be very, very important in determining the progress, because that's what actually will measure outcomes. So that's one. The other is related to the question that you raised on the repository. So at 3IE, we have a repository of now about 5,000 impact evaluations and systematic reviews of those impact evaluations, all that have been published or in the gray literature since about 1990. And they are evaluations that really try to address this issue of causality. And that's useful because I think it helps us, and it'll help the world over the next 10 years. What is it that we don't know on what will move the needle? And this is where evidence gap maps, I think, could be very useful in harnessing this knowledge. An evidence gap map is simply a visualization of the availability of evidence. It's just a matrix in which on the left-hand side you would have interventions. On the right-hand side, which is the horizontal axis, you would have the outcomes. And think of the outcomes as the SDGs over the long term. And what you want to know is which of those cells have a lot of evidence, a lot of data, and which of those that don't. Okay? And just give you a couple of examples of how we've started to use this technology in trying to assess what is the state of the evidence in moving that needles. As a project that we did with CEDL, we actually did an evidence gap map of evidence gap maps. This is the ultimate in evaluation nerdiness. So it's a map of maps. And the question was simply asked, if you were to think up how many evidence maps there have been in which the interventions are classified as sectors as defined by the World Bank, just arbitrarily, and the SDGs, which of those cells are filled out? It doesn't tell you how much evidence there is, but it tells you actually, it's interesting, it tells you whether or not there's even been a mapping of that evidence. A couple of findings were interesting. One is, as you would expect, as Howard mentioned yesterday, health is out there. There are more maps on health than anything else. There were 73 maps, by the way, which I thought was actually, since evidence gap maps were just invented by 3IE 8 years ago, that's quite a lot already. But about 28 of them are in health, or the health outcome, related to the health outcome of the SDGs. What was also interesting, though, that the second tier, 15 maps and above, were in poverty, education, maybe not unexpected, but also gender equality, inequality, and peaceful societies. So there are maps of these around, so there is a stronger evidence base. Now, where is the evidence not? It's on outcomes, SDGs related to energy, there's one. On climate change, there are two. Oceans and marine, one. And absolutely none on global partnerships. So what this does is it tells us as a development community where there might be evidence and where might be not. And maybe we have 10 years to actually start addressing this research agenda to make sure that we start filling in those cells where there might not be anything to rely on. Or at least to be aware of our vulnerabilities. So we're not so frustrated after 10 years that, hey, we didn't actually get to that stage because we didn't really know how to move that needle. The last thing I wanted to say was another thing that we're planning to do is to take that same framework in which you have SDGs as outcomes and actually asking the question, what studies are out there that have used big data to actually try to address these outcomes, either, and the interventions will be whether or not they're human-sourced informations, like Facebook or whatever, processed data, like the administrative data that Santosh talked about yesterday, or machine-generated data, such as satellites and things. And we hope to fill that out over the next few months, and at least give us an indication of whether or not the new technologies is starting to help us in addressing this data question that both Francois and Susan mentioned. So in sum, Jörg, to address your original question, certainly impact evaluations are not sufficient to address the evaluating sustainability agenda, but I think they are very necessary.
Thank you, Mani. What I find particularly striking is that you notice that in this cell of global partnerships, there is little or no evidence collection yet, and this seems
no maps.
Or there are no maps. There are no systematic collection of evidence existing in this field, and this is striking because, on the other hand, we are discussing a lot of our challenges regarding institutional partnerships on how to link. How to link agencies, on how to link different actors, and on how to cooperate on those issues. And we complain about this for many years, and on the other hand, it seems that we are not collecting evidence on this in a very systematic manner. And that leads me directly to Michaela Zintel, because Michaela has been directing one of the bilateral evaluation departments, namely the one of the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development for over a decade, I think, and she has a lot of experience in managing and overseeing evaluations in the field of bilateral development cooperation. And before that, she has been also a board member of the Inter-American Development Bank, and has been managing the division for the World Bank in the German ministry. So you have this experience of being being part of a bilateral donor and responsible for evaluation here, but at the same time having a lot of experience on how the multilateral world works in development cooperation. Against this background, I would like now to go a little bit more to the bilateral world and ask you why is there this continuous challenge among bilateral donors, also in the evaluation field, to work together and to learn together out of evaluations? So when we are in the OECD DAC evaluation group, we often tend to complain about the difficulties of joint learning among bilaterals. I would be very interested in listening to your experiences and perhaps and your recommendations about what is needed that bilateral evaluation units start working together and learn together more effectively. This is one part of the question. And the second one, which is a little bit different, goes into the direction of the multidimensionality of sustainability. So Germany is probably the bilateral donor which has very early pointed to the multidimensionality of sustainability and has requested already in 2005, 2006, its implementing agencies to start to look at the connection between these three dimensions, or between different dimensions in its evaluations. And I would like also to ask you about what your experiences has been with this regard and what others perhaps could learn about this and when addressing the challenges of evaluating sustainability.
Thank you, Jörg. Thank you for the kind introduction. Maybe one remark before I look into these issues. Now we are entering the world of donor evaluation. We are not talking about partner countries. I think this is, first of all, important to mention, and secondly, it sort of goes against the grain if we start thinking about the Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness, starting there, going through MDGs in particular now, with the Agenda 2030, the sort of implementation mode is always to say, the donors give the money, the partner countries, of course, have to, whatever, SDGs, MDGs, to implement, and they also should evaluate and provide evidence of results. Maybe that's one of my experiences. This doesn't work. If you are in a donor country, it's the same with a multilateral. Yeah? If you are, well, you will know. Your governing body, the minister of the ministry, parliament in your country will want to know evidence from the donor country. If you have a very good study, which gives you everything, and please, in Germany, it should be in German, okay? A research product or an evaluation report providing hard data, and please, because German parliament only talks German, okay? Then it would be okay. But first of all, we don't have those evaluation reports from partner countries. They're definitely not in German. So I want, because this is an audience with many people from developing countries, we are not now in an OECD DAC Evalnet meeting, I would like to stress this, and also beg you to understand why we have to keep on doing donor evaluations. It doesn't work otherwise. Second, you talk about learning between organizations, bilateral donors. Actually, I would be happy if you would even learn within an organization, because that's the sort of first challenge, and I think from experiences there, then you can go on also to look how you work sort of inter-institutionally. But nevertheless, I'd be happy to very technical points. I would say how you can go about. One is how you do it, the second is what you do, and the third is doing things differently, maybe. Very simply, starting it, we're not talking about a project evaluation, but a rather strategic one. As a donor, with the evaluator starting doing it, I think it's very good to start with a literature review, to look what is already out there to a certain topic, which is not always done. I mean, sounds very simple, but it's just not always done. And from now we're talking about the donor perspective, it gets very interesting to have this compare and contrast. Yeah, if you ask, Germany is doing whatever, whether it's education or health or what topic, but to see how, sort of a strategic questions, to look how other donors approach this issue, how they have heard, gives depth to your evaluation report. And sometimes it might even help you to give depth to efficiency questions. Because you can look into alternative approaches. If you ask me, this hasn't been used to full extent so far. The second issue is what you do. And of course, we have these synthesis reports. Yeah? If you really want to have it the way like Campbell or coming from Cochrane, of course this is very reliable data, but when we look into strategic evaluations, it gets really hard. Yeah? I think we need much more work to say, when is it good enough for more complex evaluations? Because with these studies, I think automatically you get the interest from other donors. No? if we just take the DEVAL study on the synthesis study on budget support, of course everyone who is still thinking about, very few donors do budget support these days, but first of all there are a few, and others are thinking about re-entering budget support again. So this study, that's my second point, the way you choose the topic, no? Makes a lot of difference, and you will definitely elicit more interest. No? And even there are more quick and dirty possibilities. Yeah? Just to give you a current example, a few years ago, when DEVA, together with Belgium and Netherlands, had this very nice conference in Berlin, I recall the colleague from Netherlands presenting a study on exit, because the Netherlands, terminated cooperation with a couple of countries. Now Germany is in the situation. Germany is discussing, we're working with 85 countries, I think. That is not particularly effective and efficient, yeah? So the exit issue will come up, yeah? So immediately question, what is the experience among other donors? And sometimes, and that's the same, politics cannot wait a year or and a half until you have done a systematic study. Yeah? Sometimes quick and dirty has to do. And finally, do things differently, and this is also a very old topic, and I think donors have been much better before, is doing joint evaluations. As Susanne just mentioned, in the UN group, you're discussing how you jointly approach, the big SDG issues. There is no discussion among bilateral donors like that. Of course, I mean, the place where we all meet, the evaluators at the DAC EVALNet, and OECD is probably a bit too wide. And so EU might be one, but depending on the topic or country, you might have major donors, no? Where they can link together. But I think we certainly have to go back to joint evaluations, because with joint evaluations you automatically have more of joint learning. And I think a lot has been lost over the past 10 years, that we originally had a rule, when you have joint donor financing, you have to do a joint evaluation. Unfortunately, it's got lost. Okay, that's for my part. I should mention very briefly, and nothing on evaluating sustainability. Again, for the non-evaluators, because here it's really different to research, I think. There is one of these core sets for OECD DAC evaluations, this famous 5 criteria. How you assess a project, a program, a strategy, whatever. And it's important to keep sort of a common understanding of how we do it to make evaluations comparable. Otherwise, you get, not only in your country, but across countries, evaluation reports who talk about whatever, but you cannot really pull it together. I won't go into the details, that would be a seminar, and other people better placed to talk about it. But just to give you a glimpse what we're struggling with, because, again, for non-evaluators, one of the criteria is sustainability. And there is a complete mix-up of the concept that when we talk about sustainable development, this is quite something different than the sustainability criterion of evaluators. Sustainability criterion with evaluators actually means durability. Durability of your net benefit over time. If you look into cost-benefit analysis, you mentioned it's just, extend your time horizon and say what in the end after the simple example. The project has been running for several years after the donor assistance ended, and it becomes sort of diffusion. So, what is your net effect over time? So it's almost like a ultimate efficiency criterion, although it doesn't say so. No? So when we think in terms of sustainable development, that's the integrated nature of economic, social, environmental issues, and I won't go into that, actually also political issues, yeah? So the important thing is to distinguish and to mainstream this idea of sustainable development more or less through all criteria. I think that's sort of would be my main message, and I'm glad to see that DAC Evalnet is going into that direction at the same time, and then we'll end a health warning. You cannot do everything, look at the integrated nature trade-offs, very important, all the time with any stupid project evaluation. So sometimes do no harm might be a sufficient concept.
Thank you, Michaela. Finally, I have Andreas Reumann, and I'm very to have you here as a principal evaluator from the Green Climate Fund, and also a relatively young organization, but with a big task. And I'm particularly happy to have you and your evaluation expertise at this panel, because now we can turn at one point at least into a certain sector. And one of the most pressing, the most challenging issues of today's world, or of the way forward towards sustainable development, is obviously the challenge of climate change. So given this challenge and given the increasing resources which go into these issues of mitigation and adaptation, we have to increase our efforts in understanding, in evaluating results, impacts of our endeavors in this field. And against that background, I would like you to share some of your experiences in evaluating climate change or measures for climate change adaptation and mitigation, or if you choose to concentrate only on one of them, and about the challenges and the potentials you see in evaluating and monitoring this area.
Is this working? Yeah, you can hear me. Okay. Thanks, Jörg, for inviting me, and thanks for that kind introduction. So first and foremost, I need to convey a message. So I was not supposed to be here, but my boss was supposed to be here and was scheduled. So Jo Puri sends her regards, and we wanted to convey this message that we really congratulate the GDN for bringing this conference about, or for putting this conference up here in Bonn, and for also discussing evaluations, because we think it's definitely an important step forward to not only think about knowledge and a knowledge for sustainable development, but also think about the measurement at the end. And then let me just set the scene for those of you that may not know the Green Climate Fund. So it's supposed to be the largest climate fund in the world. So we have about at the moment, $5.3 billion in projects all around the globe. It's 111 projects so far, and we are in more than 97 countries in the world. So another important remark would be that we also have a readiness support program in about 120 countries to really think about what is it that's the challenge on the ground for the countries at national level. And so when you gave me this question, and when you asked me to talk a little bit about projects, I thought to myself, okay, how can I possibly synthesize 111 projects and experiences from those projects with regards to monitoring and evaluation? Well, let me say it in this way. So the Green Climate Fund, as it was set up by the UNFCCC and also laid out as in its governing instrument, it's set out to do exactly that, 50-50. So 50% in mitigation and 50% in adaptation projects. And in a way, it tries to tackle this question by looking at 8 different result areas. So for mitigation, it looks at sectors in energy, transportation, urban cities and urban development, and forests. And on the adaptation side, it decided to say, okay, we look at health and food security, we look at the question of livelihoods, ecosystem and ecosystem services, and infrastructure, so infrastructure in the sense of built environments such as water management and so on. And when we then think about what is the wicked problem when we come to climate change and the climate change projects, we see a lot of similarities with the developing world and the development world. So the question of evaluating development projects is very, very close to climate change projects. However, there are some particular attributes that are very different and very unique for the climate change space. And so I want to talk about 3 of those attributes. So the first one is that climate change and the impact from climate change projects take a very long time. So when you think about evaluating a project, you would usually think about whatever inputs you have, whatever outcomes you adhere to, and whatever impacts you want to see at the end. For climate change projects, this is a very difficult task. So in particular, if you think about climate change mitigation projects, you would say, okay, here you look at a very long time horizon, a very long-lasting or a long process until you will find the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And basically, that's also the challenge when it comes to evaluation in particular. So when you think about theory-based evaluation, you would use particular components of that in order to evaluate the causality, as Manny said just before. And so you would look at the theory of change. You would look at the question of, okay, how can we map the outcomes, and how can we come to assessing the efficiency and effectiveness of these programs and policies that have come about. In that sense, I use an example from Plenary E. So Plenary E has done an evidence review on the question of land use policies and the effect of land use policies in 2016. And one interesting fact was that they found, okay, in the evidence review, we have an incredible amount of impact assessments and impact evaluations out there. There were about 221. The problem, however, was that none of these could actually identify the attribution element to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very interesting example. Let me give you another example very quickly. When it comes down to projects, so I've recently been to Rwanda in Kenya. So we have a project there that looks at solar home systems. So we want to reach in the area of energy, we want to reach those that don't have access to energy. So now we set out this project and we say, okay, we want to, however, do green and clean energy. So what we do is solar home stations. And we fund them through partners. And now this project is implemented and everyone is happy, and then we come in and we say, okay, let's evaluate this, let's look at this. And of course, at first you would say, of course, we want to see that there is a certain uptake. You want to see that the health has improved of the family because they're not using alternative sources like kerosene or whatever they have been using. We want to see increase in education because now the kids are unable to study even at night because they've got light, and so on and so forth. So there's a variety of different goals that we want to look at and a variety of different objectives. And then you ask yourself the question, well, so has it actually helped? So you look at this question of what works, what doesn't. But here you find yourself in that question of where are the trade-offs? So has it actually changed? And when we looked at this particular project, we found that, yes, of course, there is access now, but we found incredible evidence that showed that actually these people on the ground are now tend to use even more energy that they were estimated to use, because simply it's now available. So now we're having actually more energy consumption than before, which brings about other questions. And then we also found there's still a certain use of the kerosene, the alternative sources they have been using before. So when it comes to this question of measuring effect or measurable effects, it's very hard. Let me go to the second point. The second point is climate change as such is a public good. And that means we're bringing together a variety of different actors. And I think we've been discussing this, we've heard this before. it's all about the partnership, and it's all about this question of when you look at such a programmatic approach such as climate change, you're looking at a multitude of coalitions of stakeholders. It's not only focusing on poverty alleviation, it's focusing on a variety of different issues, and for this reason it's focusing on a variety of different people. So an example here is we have a project in Vanuatu, so the SIDS, the small island development states. And here we look at early warning systems, because we all know hurricanes, or the appearance of hurricanes has risen over recent years. And now the question is, okay, how can we actually help them to use climate information in an efficient way? And as you go along, you find yourself in this network of different SIDS that have the exact same problem. So you're actually starting to build a regional project that would look at this. And then when you ask yourself the questions of, okay, how is this climate information actually being used? You find yourself, again, in this coalition of multitude of actors that have to work together, and that's very hard. The third and last point I want to make is I've already been speaking about this a little bit. It's the question of having other goals aside of climate change. So coming from this question that we had talked about, the complexity when we talk about the different stakeholders, we have that same sort of complexity when we look at climate change projects and the variety of different goals they need to adhere to. So as I said initially, we have these result areas. So you can see there's a strong link to the question of development pathways and sustainable development pathways, even in climate. But the difficulty here is that we need to look at the trade-offs and the win-wins. So an example here would be in the mitigation side, we have a lot of projects that look at forestry and look at protected areas. And that's very close to my heart because I used to work for CIFOR, the International Forestry Research Center. So it's definitely interesting to see that there are a lot of projects that are looking at the question of how can we protect areas and forest areas. But one tricky part we have here is the leakage. So when you go about business and try to evaluate how effective this intervention has been, it comes very, very quickly that you have to look at the neighboring surroundings to find real, true counterfactuals and see, has it actually changed for the better, or in a wider, in a more systematic thinking, or more systematic macro level evaluation, you would have to look at, has it actually really been working, or are there other leakages such as people now deforesting land and clearing land for agricultural purposes just next to it or further away from the protected areas. So just to give you a brief wrap up, so basically what we're saying is when we think about climate change, we have certain problems that are not the usual problems that you would have with evaluation, such as limitation of data, not the adequate national capacities to work on this. They are, however, still there. But in addition to this, we also think about the question of complexity, how to look at complexity, how to deal with it, and the question of trade-offs as well as the long-term perspectives of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Before opening up also to the audience, I would like to ask the panelists if, because they in their interventions now have mentioned a lot of challenges regarding the evaluation of sustainability. The core topic of this conference is linking research and evaluation and policy, and we know that this is all very, very difficult. But perhaps you have also some reason for optimism. Meaning, could you share with us very shortly examples of where the bridging of evaluation or the impact of evaluation on policy making was successful and has created real change or has had a serious impact on how policies were made? And perhaps you have examples on that. Who would like to start?
are the one to start on this.
All right, let me just give you, I think, 4 lessons that we've learned in 3IE with a couple of examples in each. One is a lot of evaluators, I think, especially independent ones, before hesitated to engage with policy makers and implementers because that meant that you might lose your independence. I think one lesson that we've learned is that if your goal is accountability, then you have to be independent, and perhaps you should not have that engagement. I think what we've found is if your goal is learning, that if you engage early, even at the start of a program or project, to design an evaluation, you have more effect. One example is in India, as you might have heard, air pollution is really bad. And there was a project to look at incentives of industrial firms in Gujarat to see how they can diminish their emissions. And there, the experiment was simply to say, look, why don't we try, instead of having the firms self-report what their emissions are or pay someone to report on them, that the money actually be pooled so that they didn't do the self-reporting. And emissions actually declined by 25% as a result of that. The Gujarat Pollution Control Board now has changed the way that it is actually doing emissions monitoring in that state. So example is do it early, and often you might compromise on independence, but you learn a lot. The only other thing I'd say is, and this has been mentioned already, is communicate really well. And for that, you need to actually have teams. Researchers are not always the best communicators in plain language. They have little incentive to do so sometimes because they have to get the analytics right. You all heard stories yesterday about 800-page reports. And what we found is that if you bring in the communicators, again, in on the ground floor and you have multiple teams, the communicators also, the professionals, communicators, understand what the topic is about as opposed to disseminating it after. Stop there.
Okay, thank you, Mani.
Okay, I don't think that we have to be so pessimistic. I think that over the recent 2 or 3 recent decades, there were initiatives, policy initiatives, which were successful and which, as a matter of fact, have spread around the world. Probably the best example of that is the conditional cash transfer programs, which I know that Manny was involved in the way in which Progresa, the Mexican program, which started more or less the whole thing, was implemented. And remember that I was visiting the bank in those days. And this is a program which has been successful in generating less poverty. It is the most important element. Then it was successful in generating a little more school enrollment and improving health. So what I think was very, very important in that program is that we learned with that program that something which seemed impossible in those days, which was to transfer cash to households in developing countries, was possible. And somehow we found that redistribution, not in terms of taxation of the well-off people, but in terms of transferring to poor people, could work. And the impact of that has been enormous. We have that in many, many countries in the world, including in the poorest countries in the world, in Africa. So this is, I believe, a very, very good example of what well-thought programs, experimentation, and publicizing the result of that evaluation could do. So from that point of view, this is the kind of thing which makes me optimistic. On the other hand, what I would like to mention is that when we look into ex-ante evaluation, like what we have to do when we evaluate sustainability, it cannot be otherwise than ex-ante. I would say that we have analyses which are okay, which I think are making a lot of sense when we were talking about climate change. I mean, for many years, economists have been working on what should be done. And I would say that there is a kind of agreement with what has to be done. Now, the problem is not in the thought. The problem is in, I'm not sure it is the implementation. The problem is in the decision, which is a political decision which requires many people coming in or converging on some objective. And this is where the problem is. And this is something that we observe more or less everywhere. When we talk about the SDGs are very crazy animal in the sense that this 169 target, 260 indicators is completely crazy. But what is behind that? There is a kind of political economy, which is that people were frustrated by the MDGs because they were too simple, and they were right. But in order to correct this, everybody wanted to have its own, his or her own contribution to the SDGs. And at the end, we created a monster. What is problematic here is not so much the thought, the way, our understanding of things. What is problematic is the collective decision-making process. And at the end of the day, I think that many of the issues are global governance issues. And for a long time, I thought that climate change would be the occasion to make progress on global governance because there would be an emergency there. And I'm really sorry to see that we move on and we don't see this progress in global governance.
Thank you, François. Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually struck how similar the issues are between the research community and the evaluation community. For me, I'd like to speak about the 3 T's, and it's something I just came up with actually. It's topic, it's timeliness, and it's time. So you need to get the right topic, a relevant topic that then informs. And how do you get to that is really by creating these partnerships and looking ahead rather than looking backwards and being there. Then that leads me to timeliness. You need to be there at the right time, because if your information comes too late or comes at the wrong time, no one's going to listen. So how do you get that timeliness aspect in with the right topic? And the last one is time. And that's because the policymakers don't have time to read the reports, to read your studies, to read the evaluations. So Mani's comment about communications is huge. We are relearning how to communicate. It's not through 200-page reports. It's probably through a tweet. It might be through infographics. It might be through a podcast. The world is changing. It's changing. We're changing how we're communicating. The next generations after us will speak very differently, communicate very differently, and we need to get ahead of the game. So we need to recognize that we need different communications tools because everyone's time is limited. There's an overload of communication. So getting the right message at the right time with the right topic is really critical.
Thank you. I now would like to turn to questions from the audience, and I think we have advanced a lot now, and we still have time for 2 or 3 rounds. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Layla Al-Barad'i from the American University in Cairo. I'm concerned about the reporting on SDG 16, especially when you ask governments to submit national voluntary reports and you expect them to report on the injustices committed or the violence acts, and they end up reporting in a very ambiguous manner and saying basically nothing, and then they brag to the citizens that they've already submitted national voluntary reports and nothing else is expected from them. So what can be done about that?
Jan Andrelis from Commission for Research Partnership with Developing Countries. I wanted to know, has UN or any other organization an idea how many low and middle income countries are not able evaluating sustainability? And are there strategy to tackle this?
This is Mustafa Babikir. Yes, I agree with the panelists that the problem of evaluation is really a wicked problem. And I think the best we can be done is that ex-ante level, where you have something similar to a control experiment. But ex post, I think there's all the statistical problem there of identification, problem of additionality, and other problems is really critically very important. And so to ascertain whether the change in the outcome is due to which factors is very important, and it is largely difficult to assess. I wonder here whether it be possible to use the procedure that the CDM board used, which is a process which includes, at the project level at least, where you have a validation, where you have a validation entity which validate initially what the project, whether it contributes to sustainable development or not, and then you have a verification which will verify the outcome which is consistent or not consistent, and then you have an approver which goes to the CDM unit which really governs the whole thing. So a process like that in place which will govern the thing as is at the project level will be something useful. Thank you.
Can I take one last here in front?
Thank you. Shanta Devarajan from Georgetown. When in the discussion about evaluation capacity building in countries, what I didn't hear from the panel was the incentives that countries have and governments have to make use of evaluation findings. And in many ways, I find that the hardest nut to crack. That you do an evaluation and it's perfectly well done, it's very nicely disseminated, and it shows that the projects that they were doing was not very good. And then next thing you turn around, you find they're doing 4 more projects of the exact same type. And that's, to me, the biggest problem. And then you can see why there's some resistance to evaluation. So when you go in and tell a government, or let us evaluate your project, they're somewhat allergic because if they know that it might show up. One way in which we've made some progress is therefore not to emphasize the evaluation part, but emphasize the monitoring part, the thing that I think Francois was mentioning. Because the monitoring part, which is necessary for any evaluation, enables that government to make mid-course corrections. So you would get some results after a year or two that will actually help the project do better, and that makes the evaluation result less problematic.
Turn to the panel. Would you?
Yeah, if I may come in on the first two, on the question of the voluntary national reports raised by Laila, I believe it's important to include civil society, the public, academia in those voluntary national report discussions. There needs to be a process at country level that opens up the public debate, the space. And then I do believe governments will gradually become a bit more honest in their reporting, because I agree, in many of the voluntary national reports, you don't see much criticism. Yes, there's some progress, but certainly a lot of ambiguous language. We did a consultation as part of this SDG 4.5 meta-synthesis, where we did a feedback in Beirut and we got together government officials, civil society, academia, to discuss what we were finding in our report. It was actually really useful, and we had civil society tell government, well, you know, we're not doing well enough, and here are the issues for Lebanon. So I really believe that we need to open up this public space and bring everyone together and have those open debates. And I do recognize some countries are more difficult than others, but I think the space can be created. On the second question by Johan regarding the income, how many low-income countries are able to evaluate sustainability, it's, we don't have numbers, but we do know that there's a huge gap. And there's a gap not also on the side of the UN. When we look at the country level, where we're now saying we have to focus on much more, our own offices at country level are not really equipped to deal with these issues. So we have a massive capacity building issue at hand, and the only way to deal with that is to do joint capacity building for everyone at the country level. And that includes our own offices, but also the partners, engaging the partners and learning together. And if we don't do that together as a system, then there are a lot of missed opportunities.
Thanks. Just to address Shanta's point on incentives, I think it's absolutely critical. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But a couple of things. I think that, what is it then that will actually create those incentives? And clearly that's going to be idiosyncratic to the countries. So a couple of things I think that I've learned anyway. One is it helps to have it started at the top. In the Philippines, for example, where I was born, we have a partnership, a country partnership, in which the Ministry of Planning equivalent actually mobilizes the rest of government to actually generate evaluations that we help to support. And that's very interesting because they're the ones leading the chase, if you like. And I asked the minister, why is it that you're so interested and you've gotten your colleagues in the rest of government interested? He said, this is in the previous administration, by the way. Well, when we went to a cabinet meeting, then President Aquino, the first thing he would say when you propose a program is, what do we know about this? Has it worked elsewhere? Where does it work? What are your results going to be? And from that point on, all the cabinet members wanted to come prepared for that debate. And so it starts at the top. That's one. Now, clearly, what happens when you don't have that buy-in, which as happens in many other countries, which then subsequently happened in the Philippines with the next administration. And there my view is that, look, getting the research out to civil society is really important. That to have pressures come not from just within, but from outside. And again, there in the Philippines Conditional Cash Transfer Program, for example, getting the media involved to actually inform the debate in which people from both the left and the right were criticizing the CCT program, really helped to sustain that program. Third thing is funds help. Shanta, at the World Bank, 15 years ago, there was not a lot of evaluation going on. What helped? There was a fund that was set up initially by the Spanish. It's now a multilateral trust fund led by the British, in which project managers and others could actually apply and get that thing done. So money helps. So getting buy-in at the top, getting coalitions in place, money are, I think, three things that will help incentivize. Last thing is on your point about monitoring. I think it is very important to do that. I think there are also ways to make sure that you do the monitoring rigorously so that you can actually, as a result of, say, implementation issues, you can establish causality as to what it is that caused implementation to break down.
Thank you. Kayla.
As to the question whether DAC peer review reports on bilateral agencies are not considered effective, actually I'm not sure whether I would really agree with that statement. From my experience, very briefly, I would say if you have a good report, they are always effective because they are always used. They have so much publicity, that I've seen it with various ministers over time. First, the DAC peer review, when they come in new, and then they knew what power it has. So it is a powerful instrument. But from my experience, they're very diverse in terms of quality. I've seen DAC peer reviews, I can only talk about Germany, which were very much to the point. I've seen others where personally I said, I can't believe it. Didn't they realize that? So it depends very much on the quality also.
Thank you.
Just on two points. One was the question of low and middle income countries, are they able to evaluate sustainability? From the, and this is, I think I didn't get the chance to say what I really find beyond the challenges, what I really find is an encouragement. And one is that we have the GCF, and I'm sorry for doing that advertisement, but having a global green climate fund in that sense that really looks at it across the board, across the countries, and tries to tackle these problems in various countries is a huge opportunity. And from the perspective, and I'm not in operations, I'm from the independent evaluation unit, but in terms of what we try to do is we try to go into the countries where we are and say, okay, top to bottom, as well as bottom to top, and to look at what can we do in order to build a pipeline, in order to look at what are country programs. And here, what the GCF tries to do is, through its readiness support program, it tries to help get that initial wheel going and thinking about what can we do, where we're standing, and what are potential projects, not only for the Green Climate Fund, but also for others. So I think we're cognizant of the problem and the challenge, but I think awareness is the first step for innovation, and I think we're already at that level to address this. And secondly, and I'm absolutely in agreement with Mani on this, was the fact we need to go in early, and there's an opportunity for monitoring, and it should be utilized. And that we try to do through a learning-oriented real-time impact assessment, as we call it, briefly LOTA. And we're trying through that program to go into the projects early on and help to design with the counterparties in the country to what can we do in order to get those quick messages, and that came also from you, those quick takeaways, those learnings that we need in order to navigate through the different projects as we go along and through the different changing contexts and contextual problems as well. So yes, one last point. I agree what has been said. The first comment on it's worrisome when we think about how to involve all the different parts, and I think, the message is the civil society organizations need to be strengthened just as much as everyone else in the country, and we need to have that dialogue on the ground as well as at higher level. Absolutely.
Thank you, Andreas.
Yes, on the second question about how many low-income countries are able to evaluate, or monitor the development goals. I think that the statistical issue is absolutely important. And there is an organization called Paris 21, which is an association of statistical institutes around the world, especially in developed countries, which is really trying to manage this issue, trying to make sure that there are the number of surveys which are being taken in order to monitor poverty, to monitor health, to monitor education, are done in as many countries as possible and as frequently as possible. So I don't have in mind what the figures are, and it is not a number of countries. I mean, we should look at the number of surveys by year, etc. So it's slightly more complicated than a single number. Now, with this, I want to also go to Chantal's comment, and I really believe that monitoring is extraordinarily important. I mean, okay, let's go back to the surveys. But if in a country every 4, 5, third, fourth, fifth year there was the publication of the poverty figure, saying, okay, the poverty line is so much, and since last time we had a survey, this is the way in which poverty evolved. This is by how much poverty is going down, or this is by how much it has been going up. This is an incredibly important information, and this is not evaluation. This is not evaluating the policy. It is maybe in a country the poverty will not have gone down very much, but this is not because of the policy which were followed, simply because there was the international context was not favorable. But to have that information is absolutely crucial. And when we look at governance issues in many countries, I talked about global governance a little earlier, the problem of local governance in many countries is either that information is not available, or not frequently enough, or it is not comparable to the past, or it is completely manipulated, because the figures which come out of the National Statistical Institute are not the right ones. But this is where the emphasis should be put. Many issues would be very, very different in many countries if that information was freely available. And when we look at what is going on today in Lebanon, when we look at what has been going on in Tunisia, in Egypt, etc., somehow there is something of this type behind that. I mean, there is a lack of transparency of this fundamental data. This is not evaluation. It is really pure information on what is going on in the country. And we don't need very complicated apparatus to make progress in that direction and to try to impose this kind of transparency to governments in countries.
Thank you. Unfortunately, time is over, and we now have to close this session. I think there are many questions from the audience. There are many challenges left, and I think we will meet again to discuss advancements and challenges of evaluation. What I've learned is, and I want to finalize with three points. Being aware of the fact that this is probably a very incomplete picture I will give, is that we as evaluators and from different agencies and organizations also face serious collective action challenges. We need to invest more in first joint policies. What do we want with evaluations? How are we going to organize evaluations so that evaluation can fulfill its knowledge, learning, and control function? But we also have to do then to work better together, to do more joint evaluations, and to a certain extent to overcome the fragmented institutional setup that we as evaluation entities live in. And thirdly, in this collective action realm, we have to invest more in in evidence, systematic evidence collection, be it in systematic reviews, evidence gap maps, in order to make use of the existing evidence in a more efficient and effective way. And at the same time, we have to better link, or to link to policymakers in a more effective way by trying to communicate better, to, as several panelists have mentioned, to improve the way in which we communicate to our policy audience, but also, and this is a long time recommendation from evaluations and for evaluation, to enter earlier into the policy cycle and not to consider evaluation as an only ex post thing that looks at things when everything else is done. So these are crucial issues which we should take away in order to improve our impact on policies. But at the same time, I was particularly grateful to the examples mentioned here. And one example is the example of conditional cash transfers, that there are examples where things worked out well, where we as evaluators and researchers did a good job in putting together rigorous evidence, where we were able to communicate to policymakers on what worked and what didn't, and where policymakers in turn took up the messages and the recommendations and were able to spread successful and effective lessons to different regions and to different contexts. And by that, I would like to end with this positive and optimistic note. So there are a lot of challenges, as in all panels you have said, you have probably listened, but there are also good examples. There are examples of successfully connecting research, evaluation, and policies, and we should perhaps a little bit more look at these successful cases and see what we can learn from that in order to build better bridges between research, evaluation, and policies. And with that, I thank all 5 panelists for being here, for sharing their experiences and insights. with the audience. And I, of course, thank you as the audience of being here and hopefully taking up some of these issues which I've mentioned today. I wish you all a very good conference and a nice weekend and a safe trip home after this conference. Thank you. It's off. No. Sorry. I was told to remind you all to vote for the poster prize until noon, until 12 o'clock. That would be great. So have a look at the posters and give your vote. Thank you.